Imagine standing at the edge of the famous Battery in Charleston, not surrounded by the lush, palmetto-lined promenades, the elegant Pastel mansions, or the quiet clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages that tourists flock to see today, but sinking ankle-deep in a putrid, sweltering mudflat where the air itself feels heavy enough to drown you. Strip away the charm, the cobblestones, and the polished veneer of Southern hospitality. In the year 1700, this is not a gentleman's retreat. It is a suffocating, disease-ridden outpost clinging desperately to the edge of a hostile continent. You are standing in a place so deeply infected with rot and misery that surviving a single humid summer is considered a statistical anomaly. The beautiful peninsula you know was, in reality, a terrifying death trap, surrounded by impenetrable, predator-filled swamps to the west and a volatile, pirate-infested ocean to the east. The early settlers didn't stroll under weeping oaks. They suffocated in a humid basin that bred invisible killers, where the smell of rotting marsh gas mixed daily with the stench of unwashed bodies and raw desperation. It was a brutal frontier penal colony in all but name, a place where the mortality rate was so catastrophically high that back in England, it was whispered that only madmen and those running from the hangman would ever dare buy a ticket to Charlestown. Yet despite the oppressive heat and the ever-present shadow of death, ships kept arriving, dropping off some of the most fiercely intelligent and coldly ambitious people on the planet. They didn't come to this muddy spit of land seeking religious sanctuary or a peaceful farming life like the pilgrims up north. They willingly walked into this sweltering green hell because they brought something far more dangerous than just muskets and plows. They brought a highly calculated, utterly ruthless blueprint for extracting unimaginable wealth, and they were prepared to build their paradise on top of as many corpses as it took. But to understand how they engineered this bloody fortune, you have to look at what they were desperately trying to keep out, and more importantly, what they were trying to lock in. Cast your mind back through the centuries and visualize the heavy, imposing timber and earthwork fortifications that physically choked the Oyster Point Peninsula. Charlestown was the only major English settlement in North America that felt compelled to enclose itself entirely behind a massive, fortified wall, a stark architectural confession of their absolute paranoia. They were effectively a besieged island of English ambition, surrounded by a 360-degree theater of enemies. Just to the south lay the heavily armed Spanish stronghold of St. Augustine, whose forces treated the Carolina colony as an illegal, heretical intrusion and constantly plotted to wipe it off the map. From the vast, unmapped wilderness to the west, deeply wronged indigenous nations watched the colonists with growing, justified fury as the relentless expansion of the settlement threatened to swallow their ancestral lands. And out on the roaring Atlantic to the east, the very sea routes that brought them their desperately needed supplies were prowled by ruthless privateers and pirates who viewed the vulnerable port as a prime target for plunder. Every heavy cannon positioned along the bastions and every armed watchman patrolling the muddy parapets was a testament to a society living in a state of perpetual, high-strung terror. The citizens of this claustrophobic fortress were practically suffocating behind their own defensive lines, trading physical freedom for a desperate illusion of security. Yet this aggressive military posture was ultimately futile against the true nightmare that was already creeping over the barricades. The heavy wooden palisades might have been capable of stopping a Spanish musket ball or a pirate boarding party, but they were completely useless against an invisible enemy that bred in the stagnant, humid air of the surrounding tidal marshes. While the frightened elites stared out over their ramparts, a silent, microscopic killer was already multiplying in the muddy pools right beneath their boots, preparing to unleash a biological slaughter so devastating it would make the threat of foreign invasion seem like a minor inconvenience. While the terrified colonists braced for an onslaught of microscopic death and foreign invasion, the true architects of Charlestown's misery had already slipped inside the gates. Back in London, The 8 wealthy lords proprietors who owned this land had envisioned a perfect, orderly utopia, even hiring the great philosopher John Locke to draft the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, a visionary blueprint for a grand aristocratic society. But that high-minded parchment was effectively shredded the moment a ruthless faction known as the Goose Creek Men dropped their anchors in the harbor. These men did not sail directly from the polite parlors of England. They were the hardened, aggressive second sons of the brutal sugar plantations in Barbados. Having run out of land on their Caribbean island, they arrived in Carolina not to build a pious community, but to establish a fiercely profitable, unregulated enterprise. Acting much like America's first colonial mafia, the Goose Creek Men scoffed at Locke's idealistic laws, immediately monopolizing the local government, intimidating their political rivals, and openly operating a shadow economy built on smuggling and systemic violence. They brought with them the Barbadian Slave Code, a terrifying legal framework designed to strip humans of every conceivable right and reduce them to mere cogs in a relentless agricultural machine. They weren't pilgrims seeking religious freedom. They were cutthroat venture capitalists determined to turn this muddy, disease-ridden frontier into their own personal fiefdom, completely outside the control of the British Crown. Through bribery, extortion, and sheer aristocratic arrogance, they hijacked the very foundation of the colony, transforming Charlestown into a ruthless syndicate that valued profit margins above human life. Yet to achieve the staggering, ungodly level of wealth they ultimately craved, simply farming the swampy land was not going to be enough. Before they ever learned to harvest the legendary Carolina gold rice, these ambitious warlords of the Lowcountry realized they needed a much more lucrative and far more sinister commodity to export, sparking one of the most horrifying and deliberately forgotten atrocities in early American history. That forgotten atrocity was the systematic enslavement and extermination of tens of thousands of Native Americans, a brutal enterprise that transformed the early Carolina colony into the epicenter of a massive, blood-soaked human trafficking network. While polished history books often focus on the lucrative deerskin trade that mapped the frontier, the grim reality is that those same forested trade routes were primarily used to march chained indigenous captives straight into the bustling docks of Charlestown. Led by ruthless, self-serving political figures like Governor James Moore Sr., the ruling faction organized devastating, military-style raids deep into Spanish Florida, completely obliterating peaceful mission towns and capturing entire indigenous populations without a shred of mercy. These terrified captives weren't just put to work clearing local fields. They were coldly commodified and exported like barrels of timber or salt. Charlestown's harbor rapidly became a crowded departure point for ships loaded with Native American slaves, destined to be worked to an early grave on the very Caribbean sugar plantations these ruthless elites had originally migrated from. It was a vicious, highly profitable cycle of destruction that nearly depopulated the entire southeastern frontier, funding the lavish, emerging lifestyles of the city's aristocracy entirely with the blood of the region's original inhabitants. The sheer, horrifying scale of this indigenous slave trade was so staggering that in the early years of the 18th century, Carolina actually exported more native slaves out of the colony than it imported African laborers into it. But this insatiable, violent greed came with a devastating, unintended biological consequence that no amount of stolen wealth or heavy artillery could possibly stop. As the aggressive merchants relentlessly cleared the surrounding swamps to expand their urban footprint and packed more desperate, traumatized human bodies into the sweltering, dangerously unsanitary confines of the walled peninsula, they inadvertently engineered the absolute, perfect breeding ground for a catastrophe. The very environment they were so desperate to conquer was about to aggressively strike back, unleashing an invisible, agonizing horror that would soon turn the muddy streets of their heavily guarded fortress into an open-air graveyard and force the panicked, surviving elites to drastically rethink the entire demographic future of their dark capitalist experiment. That invisible horror stalking the muddy, overcrowded streets was a lethal combination of malaria and the terrifyingly gruesome yellow fever, a disease the panicked colonists chillingly dubbed stranger's fever because of its brutal tendency to slaughter newly arrived Europeans. As the sweltering low-country summer peaked, the death toll would skyrocket so rapidly that the ringing of church bells for the deceased had to be legally banned just to prevent absolute mass hysteria from tearing the besieged city apart. Victims experienced a sudden, agonizing spike in temperature, their skin and eyes turning a ghastly, jaundiced yellow as their internal organs aggressively failed, culminating in the horrific final stage of vomiting coagulated black blood before their bodies completely shut down in agony. The rigidly arrogant elites, utterly ignorant of the microscopic world and vector-borne illnesses, blindly blamed the catastrophic death waves on the poisonous, rotting miasma drifting off the cleared marshes, or aggressively framed it as the fiery wrath of an angry god punishing a sinful population. They had absolutely no idea that the true executioners were the swarms of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, breeding prolifically in the stagnant, deforested wetlands they had violently disrupted, and in the wooden water casks of the very ships bringing their stolen human cargo from the Caribbean. This recurring biological nightmare turned Charlestown into a literal charnel house, where wealthy merchants and hardened soldiers alike dropped dead in the muck, making the white European mortality rate so catastrophically high that the colony's very survival hung by a fragile, rotting thread. The brutal Barbadian syndicate suddenly realized that their dream of an aristocratic empire was actively bleeding out, as they simply could not import vulnerable English laborers fast enough to keep pace with the overflowing graveyards. But the ruthless lords of the Low Country were far too greedy to ever abandon their highly profitable, blood-soaked experiment to the swamp. To keep their ruthless capitalist machine churning, they desperately needed a new, massive workforce, one that not only possessed a tragic, localized resistance to these specific tropical diseases, but also held the complex, highly specialized agricultural genius required to tame the flooded landscape, setting the stage for a monumental demographic shift that would fundamentally rewrite the DNA of the entire American South. That monumental shift came in the form of a tiny, unassuming grain that would violently transform the destiny of the colony: rice, soon to be globally revered as Carolina gold. This crop single-handedly turned Charlestown into the wealthiest city on the North American continent, generating staggering fortunes that rivaled the elite estates of Europe. But here is the massive, deliberately suppressed historical truth. The English aristocrats who claimed credit for this booming economy had absolutely no idea how to grow it. Cultivating tidal rice in swampy floodplains requires highly advanced hydrological engineering, complex irrigation systems, and specific milling techniques that were entirely foreign to the British Isles. The staggering wealth of Charleston was not built on European ingenuity, but entirely on the stolen intellectual property and backbreaking labor of enslaved West Africans. The ruthless Barbadian syndicate specifically targeted and trafficked captives from Africa's rice coast, actively exploiting their generational agricultural genius to conquer the lethal, flooded low-country environment. These captive men and women were not just brute laborers, they were chained engineers who were brutally forced to terraform a hostile wilderness into a vast, highly profitable agricultural machine under the constant threat of the whip. Because this massive, relentless terraforming required thousands of skilled hands, the transatlantic slave ships began arriving in Charlestown at a terrifying, industrialized pace. Almost overnight, the demographic reality of the colony violently flipped, making it the first and only major settlement in North America with a clear black majority. The city's harbor became the largest port of entry for enslaved Africans on the continent, forever searing the brutal legacy of human trafficking into the very foundation of the city. But this explosive, forced demographic shift created an immediate, suffocating psychological crisis for the ruling elites. When a tiny, deeply paranoid white minority realizes they are completely surrounded and vastly outnumbered by a massive, fiercely resilient population of captive people whom they torture daily, they can never truly sleep soundly again. The sheer, constant terror of an impending, justified uprising forced the white elites to radically weaponize the very layout of their city, transforming their muddy, bustling streets into an airtight, highly militarized surveillance state designed to crush the slightest whisper of rebellion before it could even spark. To physically crush that spark, the city engineered a brutal architecture of fear, turning every muddy alley and iron gate into a component of a massive, open-air prison. Peer through the shadows and look past the heavy brick walls of the notorious workhouse, a grim facility that would later be chillingly associated with the brutal sugar house. This wasn't a civic building for public labor. It was a centralized, state-sponsored torture center strategically positioned to project absolute terror across the peninsula. Here, paranoid slave owners could legally outsource the horrific physical punishment of their captives to city officials, ensuring that the agonizing screams echoing from its heavy brick confines served as a constant psychological deterrent to the enslaved black majority. The entire urban layout was actively weaponized, with strict, suffocating curfews enforced by an aggressive, heavily armed city watch that violently demanded written passes from any person of color moving through the streets. If you were caught without the proper parchment, the consequences were swift, bloody, and entirely legally sanctioned. But this claustrophobic level of control wasn't just limited to the enslaved. The sheer, unrelenting pressure of maintaining this violent racial hierarchy created a toxic atmosphere of profound mistrust among the white elites themselves. The paranoid aristocracy became so hyper-vigilant that they passed laws requiring every white male citizen to carry a loaded firearm to church on Sundays, literally transforming places of worship into heavily armed garrisons in anticipation of a sudden uprising. They were so deeply terrified of losing their grip on their stolen empire that they began to aggressively police their own ranks, desperate to root out anyone who might show a flicker of dangerous leniency or political dissent. As the immense blood-soaked wealth from the Carolina gold rice fields continued to flood into the city, the psychological tension reached a violent boiling point, proving that when you build a society entirely on extreme oppression, that same paranoia inevitably bleeds upward. This suffocating atmosphere of suspicion meant that the ruling class didn't just need a physical fortress and a massive arsenal to protect their fortunes. They desperately needed a powerful, unassailable ideological weapon to legitimize their tyranny, aggressively twisting the concept of divine law into an iron-fisted tool for absolute political dominance. That absolute political dominance was brilliantly disguised under a polished veneer of religious piety, earning Charleston the ultimately ironic nickname of the Holy City. In its early, desperate years, the colony had aggressively advertised religious tolerance to lure a much-needed labor force of French Huguenots and dissenting Protestants to their muddy shores, promising them the freedom to worship without fear of persecution. But as the terrifying reality of the black majority took hold, and the staggering wealth of the rice fields filled the coffers of the Barbadian mafia, the ruling elite realized that true power required absolute conformity. They orchestrated a ruthless political coup disguised as a spiritual awakening, culminating in the notorious Church Act of 1706, which violently stripped voting rights and political power from anyone who refused to conform strictly to the Church of England. This wasn't a sudden, genuine religious revival. It was a cold, calculated purge designed to permanently disenfranchise their political rivals, seize total control of the colonial assembly, and use state-sponsored religion to legally enforce their brutal class and racial hierarchies. Under this draconian act, the government forcibly collected taxes from everyone, regardless of their actual faith, solely to build massive, imposing Anglican churches like St. Philip's, turning these towering brick steeples into dominant physical symbols of their oppressive regime. They weaponized the pulpit, mandating that ministers preach strict obedience to the ruling class, and aggressively frame the horrific institution of slavery as part of a divine, unchangeable, natural order. They built a society that demanded absolute moral perfection from the lower classes and the enslaved, punishing minor spiritual infractions with brutal public humiliation or physical mutilation. Yet behind the towering church doors and the self-righteous prayers, this pious aristocracy was operating with staggering, breathtaking hypocrisy. Because while the wealthy merchants and corrupt magistrates were loudly praising God and demanding absolute legal obedience in the town square, they were simultaneously slipping down to the fog-drenched docks under the cover of darkness, eagerly shaking hands and striking highly illegal, incredibly lucrative deals with the most violent, bloodthirsty criminals roaming the Atlantic Ocean. Those violent criminals were the infamous pirates of the Golden Age, and for decades, the esteemed merchants of Charlestown didn't just tolerate them, they actively rolled out the red carpet. Because the British Crown imposed restrictive navigation acts, demanding crippling taxes and forcing the colony to trade exclusively with England, the greedy Barbadian faction desperately needed a black market to maximize their staggering profits. Pirates like Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet were initially welcomed into the harbor as highly valued business partners, freely strolling the muddy streets and unloading mountains of plundered Spanish silver, untaxed sugar, and stolen luxury goods directly into the hands of the pious aristocracy. It was a deeply corrupt, lucrative alliance forged in the foggy inlets of the Low Country, where the magistrates gladly turned a blind eye to mass murder on the high seas, as long as they received a steep discount on imported silk. But there is absolutely no honor among thieves, and as the immense wealth from the Carolina gold rice fields transformed Charlestown from a struggling frontier outpost into a bustling, legitimate maritime powerhouse, the pirate fleet suddenly morphed from a convenient asset into a massive financial liability. When rogue captains began blockading the harbor and aggressively attacking the merchant ships carrying the colony's precious rice exports, the ruling elite realized their attack dogs had finally turned on them. In a breathtaking display of ruthless pragmatism, the exact same aristocrats who used to drink rum with these outlaws abruptly funded heavily armed expeditions to hunt them down without mercy. The Dark Alliance ended with a gruesome spectacle, as dozens of captured pirates were dragged before the very magistrates they used to bribe, swiftly condemned and brutally hanged by the neck at the water's edge. Their rotting corpses were chained into iron cages and left dangling for months, a horrifying visual warning to anyone daring to threaten the city's profit margins. Having purged their former criminal allies, terrorized the enslaved majority into submission, and completely hijacked the local government, this ultra-wealthy colonial mafia finally realized they had amassed so much power that they no longer wanted to answer to absolutely anyone. They no longer wanted to answer to absolutely anyone, least of all the distant, demanding lords proprietors who still technically owned the colony and constantly demanded a cut of the immense rice fortunes. In a stunningly arrogant and entirely successful political coup, the wealthy planters and merchants banded together to overthrow their founding proprietors, petitioning the British Crown to become a royal colony simply to better protect their exploding profit margins. As the 1720s and 1730s rolled in, the city was generating so much unimaginable wealth from the brutal engine of global capitalism that the heavy, suffocating timber walls of the old fortress could no longer contain it. The defensive barricades were aggressively torn down, the moats were filled in, and the claustrophobic settlement rapidly expanded into a sprawling, opulent metropolis. The paranoid colonial mafia had successfully transformed their sweltering, disease-ridden death trap into the wealthiest city in North America. But that staggering prosperity bred a dangerous level of hubris. Decades later, the descendants of these exact same ruthless venture capitalists would look at the British king, the very monarch they once begged for protection, and decide they were far too rich to pay his taxes, helping to light the massive powder keg of the American Revolution. The fiery rhetoric of liberty that echoed through the port was championed by an elite class whose entire fortunes were built on the most comprehensive system of human bondage the continent had ever seen. So, the next time you walk down the picturesque, sun-drenched cobblestone streets of modern Charleston, past the elegant wrought iron gates and the beautifully restored Pastel mansions, remember that you are not just strolling through a charming historical preservation. You are walking directly over the unmarked graves of a brutal, hyper-capitalist laboratory, a society obsessed with absolute control and ruthless exploitation, whose dark, blood-soaked legacy silently forged the economic spine of the American empire. If you want to uncover more terrifying truths buried beneath the polished myths of history, hit subscribe and join us as we excavate our next lost world.